Hello and welcome to the latest episode of ESG Talk, your go-to source for insights and advice from leaders in environment, social, and governance. I'm today's host, Steve Soter, filling in for Mandy McReynolds. This season is all about showcasing different perspectives, and we thought, what better way to do that than to feature more voices throughout the year? So I am very happy to be one of those other voices. Our regular ESG Talk listeners might remember me from a few episodes last season. If you're new, though, my background is in accounting, and today I'm here to give a brief update on SEC regulation as it relates to ESG. First up, let's talk climate disclosure. Last March, the SEC proposed new rules to disclose the impacts of climate risk on SEC-registered companies. If the rules are adopted as they're drafted right now, public companies will need to add several pieces of information to their 10Ks, including their strategy toward climate and data on their greenhouse gas emissions, as well as the impacts of climate on their financial statement line items. These requirements would also apply to companies who are looking to go public. Now, importantly, these rules, as written, would require significant integration of climate and financial data in order to meet the proposed disclosure requirements. And much of that would be subject to financial statement audit scrutiny, internal controls over financial reporting, and the provisions of Sarbanes-Oxley. In response to the proposal, the SEC received more than 14,000 comment letters, and they're now sorting through the public's feedback, writing a final rule, and building a case for why the new requirements are both necessary and legally defensible, especially with newly in charge U.S. House Republicans looking to pull back what they view is an overly aggressive SEC. Now, the SEC's public agenda calls for a final rule in April, but the SEC doesn't often meet their own deadlines. Now, for my part, I've heard rumors suggesting that we could see something before the end of winter, or that the SEC is going to scrap the proposal altogether, which I will just tell you is very, very unlikely. Maybe we'll just call it impossible. But if your organization is impacted by these rules, I'd probably anticipate something in the next few months, and I would definitely begin to think through the impact this will have in your financial reporting and disclosure processes. Now, ironically enough, at least in my opinion, how a company prepares and responds to the SEC's climate proposal, as well as other ESG mandates across the globe, may be a very strong indicator into how well that organization's governance processes are working. Moving on, the SEC's climate disclosure proposal was an understandably hot topic last year, and in some respects, it overshadowed other ESG-related proposals that are on the horizon. One example that I think about often is a separate SEC disclosure proposal that we expect related to human capital management. In fact, after the SEC released the climate proposal last year, Mandy and I both agreed that human capital was next. Now, human capital disclosure is not a new thing at the SEC. Back in 2020, while we were all dealing with COVID and lockdowns, SEC rules went into effect that require a description of a public company's human capital resources, to the extent it's material anyway, as well as any human capital measures or objectives that are used in managing the business. And these largely qualitative disclosures can be found in 10Ks today. But in response to calls for more prescriptive and quantitative human capital disclosure, as indicated by statements from current and former SEC leadership anyway, the SEC's public agenda now shows a proposal for these more prescriptive disclosures to be issued in April. Now, as I mentioned before, I'd take the SEC's public timelines with a grain of salt. However, I would definitely expect prescriptive and quantitative human capital disclosures that will allow investors to assess the extent to which companies invest in their employees in the same way that they allow investors to assess the way companies invest in their physical operations. Now, I've been very interested in human capital disclosures. I'm really looking forward to a conversation that we're going to have with the Hershey Company. And they've been thinking about these disclosures and human capital generally as a key strategy for a very long time. So keep an eye out for a future episode on that. Now, part of what interests me about human capital will be the reaction that the marketplace, and specifically that financial reporting and legal professionals, are going to have to a potential SEC requirement. I do wonder if in some circles there may even be more of an outcry that these disclosures don't belong in SEC filings. But whatever happens with the climate disclosure and human capital management proposals, the intersection of ESG and financial reporting seems to be quickly approaching an inflection point. Now, from a practical standpoint, ESG and financial reporting teams will have to align to very different timelines, processes, and data streams in order to be unified and to comply with these rules. But beyond that, all SEC proposals and disclosure requirements are based on the SEC's traditional definition of materiality, which is defined as whatever a reasonable investor would find impactful in their investment decisions. In contrast to SEC reporting, however, ESG materiality, as many of our listeners know, includes a much broader group of stakeholders, including customers and employees and the communities where a company operates. Navigating this difference is going to be increasingly challenging because these two definitions of materiality don't exist in a vacuum, especially financial statement materiality. And let me illustrate. You see, an ESG metric may today be completely immaterial for financial reporting purposes, meaning that a reasonable investor doesn't really care about it. On the other hand, when that metric becomes extremely important for communities, employees, and especially customers whose buying decisions may be significantly impacted by that metric, well, investors are going to start paying attention, and what was previously immaterial to them may quickly become very, very material and very important. See, this sort of analysis and alignment is going to take time, buy-in, and massive collaboration across departments. CEOs and CFOs, or really anyone who's involved in this work, should be asking themselves, do we have the right processes, teams, and technology to be properly considering these questions in the highly scrutinized field of regulated reporting? And that applies generally, by the way, and globally, not just to the SEC. Here's the thing, at least in my opinion. Complying with the SEC and other regulation like the CSRD in the UK and Europe, which has already passed, is absolutely critical. Meeting the resounding need from investors and stakeholders for ESG-related information is absolutely critical. And make no mistake, that information has got to be reliable and ready for scrutiny. For that reason, I understand why incorporating ESG in financial reporting can be scary. And because ESG has become so political, I also get why it can feel increasingly perilous to talk about it. So how is all this going to come together? Well, look, at least in my opinion, common sense is going to be the answer. If I could be a little vulnerable for just a moment, I don't really consider myself to be what some might call an environmentalist. However, I detest single-use plastics. I avoid them whenever possible. I absolutely hate glitter, and not just because it sticks to my clothes. And I do absolutely whatever I can to minimize my impact on the environment. By the same vein, I don't really consider myself to be very socially conscious. However, racial, gender, and other forms of inequality bother me deeply. And so I do what I can as an employee, as a manager, and even as a human to make it right. You see, to me, this simply just means common sense. And this is where I think an enduring connection between ESG and financial reporting is ultimately going to land. I love this quote from James Quincy, the CEO at Coca-Cola, because it sums up my thinking perfectly. And he says, quote, "If ESG becomes toxic as a phrase, which it basically has in the US, it doesn't matter to me. I'm just going to stop saying ESG. But the idea that for my basic product, I want to be water positive, I want to have a circular economy on my packaging, and I want to grow our business with less sugar, you can call it anything you like. But no one with common sense says those are bad ideas. My business strategy is constant and clear and centered around the business and the things that consumers care about and that fix societal problems. If people want to attach labels to it, that's their issue. I'm saying this business will be great if I fix these problems, and it will be good for shareholders, and it will be good for society." Close quote. Look, ESG is not just about doing the right thing. A solid ESG strategy rooted in common sense improves business performance, increases competitiveness, generates cost savings, attracts investors, and drives customer loyalty. It's for these reasons and not regulation that corporate reporting, including some form of financial and ESG reporting, will become table stakes. So while politicians duke it out in the news and the SEC works out however they're going to balance progress with perception, many corporate leaders have already moved beyond, and they're asking themselves, instead of why, they're asking themselves how. How do you determine what ESG risks are material to your business? How do you implement and report on common sense ways to make an impact for your shareholders and your stakeholders? And how does that translate into trusted financial and ESG reporting? Well, I will end it here. Now, Mandy, if you're listening, thank you so much for sharing the mic with me this week. And to our audience, thank you for joining us for another episode of ESG Talk, brought to you by Workiva, the world's leading platform for integrated regulatory, financial, and ESG reporting. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If so, please stay tuned because I will be back and there will be some more guest hosts from Workiva's lineup. Now, in the meantime, I am also the co-host of Off the Books, Workiva's original podcast. So if you're interested in accounting, finance, and maybe some lighthearted banter, please check us out. Thank you so much for tuning in.